Hello? There we are. Okay. All right. So hello, everybody again. And we met on the field trip. So it's nice to be here and to talk about more of the work about what we've been doing at the city. And I don't know why you've got, that looks like the wrong slide. I'm hoping that the rest of the slides are okay. A bit of a disclaimer. I am not a gender expert. So, but I'm very pleased to hear Grace talk about this more broadly in terms of social networks and the ways in which we encourage people, civil society, to actually work together and to start developing networks around things like urban water resilience, because that is the sort of example that I want to share. Okay, this is not my my presentation. All right. Yes, definitely, that's better. So just to also pick up on, I'm very pleased to hear that Mike was included in today's lineup, because I think he provided us with a very clear outline of the problems that Cape Town has faced, and certainly during day zero, but actually ongoing problems, the cumulative impacts of both urbanization and climate change. So it's not only droughts, it's things like flooding. There's a picture there in Johannesburg, huge loss of wetlands, loss of biodiversity, sedimentation. This is the Theawaterskloof Dam during the drought, increased hardened surfaces, major problems with water quality, as you can see in that informal settlement picture up at the top right. And the fact that we're having to start thinking about these alternative sources of water makes us much more interested in the whole concept of urban water resilience. So we talk about a resilience approach for South Africa that starts to integrate across all of these water sectors in response to these multiple risks, and the ways in which we have to break silos. And those silos are not only from an engineering perspective, but obviously also from a social perspective. How do people engage in these spaces so that we can start highlighting the links between droughts and floods and fire and all the other issues that become associated with climate? With a very important proviso now, and as you will have seen from Mike's presentation with the new water strategy, is how to build in water sensitivity and water resilience into cities through in particular, the provision of blue-green infrastructure and waterscapes that can start assisting in that resilience. So, and importantly for us, this is also not only about the physical implementation of this infrastructure and how we do it and how we involve citizens in the space, but how we can also rethink governance and policy in terms of the scale of the implementation and the different actors and stakeholders that are involved. So we talk about water sensitive design and water sensitive cities. It's a sort of incorporates both new sources and new ways of thinking around water management. Water sensitive design is really aimed at trying to return the water cycle in urban areas back more towards a natural water balance. So in a natural water balance, you would have large amounts of rain falling on permeable surfaces, infiltrating into groundwater, very little amount of runoff, usually not very polluted. When you start interfering with that urban water balance and creating a lot of hardened surfaces, the same amount of rain might fall, but now you have a huge volume of highly polluted runoff that happens. You have to import water, as we've seen in the city of Cape Town. There are big volumes of wastewater discharge and much reduced infiltration. So when you start bringing green infrastructure into the space and the reuse and recycling of water within the urban balance, the urban water cycle, you can start bringing it back into balance. And that all then creates a water sensitive city. And here the emphasis is on engaging with people and making sure that people across all walks of life are involved in the ways in which these water sensitive cities are created and designed, and involved in the ongoing maintenance, so that they become sustainable, resilient, productive, and livable through this combination of physical infrastructure, governance and social engagement. Here, water-sensitive design is the process and water-sensitive city is the destination. So what we talked about during the field trip and where we went to as part of our first trip was a project that we're doing that looks at this focus of blue-green infrastructure and the ways in which cities can provide ecosystem services so that this urban water management in multiple functions can provide the core for urban spaces that are fit to cope with future challenges. And we're doing this in South Africa from a space of creation of guidelines and documents, largely thanks to the WRC. We've been working together with the Water Research Commission for a period of about 15 years now in developing frameworks and guidelines for water-sensitive design, for sustainable drainage systems, for thinking about how we can embed this type of policy more broadly in civil society, but specifically at local government level. And this has involved, putting together the frameworks and guidelines, but also identifying champions in these spaces at very small local levels, doing the type of demonstration projects at scale and building learning alliances across civil society and government. So what role does gender play in this? Engineering and water resource management a whole, even in the more progressive universities, we are seeing that it is still pretty much male dominated. It is a space where women don't necessarily have the options to build careers. Infrastructure design and planning seldom takes women's and particularly children's needs and those who may struggle with disability into account. And water use practices within homes are still largely the responsibility of women, who are then generally not taken into account in decision-making structures. And we've heard this through Grace's talk this morning. So in our PAUSE project, the Pathways to Water Resilient South African Cities project, which you saw one aspect of that project in the Mitchell's Plain Pond, what we're trying to do is to identify opportunities for the physical and institutional integration of these hybrid decentralized blue-green infrastructure spaces into the urban water cycle. And the impetus for this is to try and transition towards a water-sensitive city, which is the city's intention going forward. The point of this, it came at the end of the drought. As I explained to you, we were trying to create an alternative water supply for the city by really making that integration of stormwater into the groundwater system much more efficient and improving the water quality of that system. So, and we wanted to do it with nature-based approaches. We wanted to do it with low impact, low cost, co-created and co-designed approaches with local residents that would start bringing in these landscape-based solutions into the city. And then obviously to look at that through a planning and policy lens so that we could understand how it would work in that local context. So we were very well aware that the work that we started with, the sort of on-the-ground research, might very well consolidate the sort of gender issues that were already present in this area, because we could see from the teams of local residents that came, put their hands up to come and do the work, that were doing the construction of the retrofit with us, that it was largely men, and that women were really relegated to catering roles or looking after children at the side of the site. So these are pictures showing what it was like during the construction. There is one woman there. She is a champion in the community, and she has been really instrumental in trying to drive some of the work that we've been doing. But you can see largely teams were led and the decision making was made by men. You've seen this, the completed retrofit, although it was very overgrown when you saw it there on Tuesday. But there you can sort of see this was at the beginning of summer when we just finished the retrofit. It hadn't grown to much extent, although there was the beginnings of that swampy area in the middle. And then I wanted to get this, but I'm not sure if I can. Is there a possibility of putting this little video on the side? Sorry, tech people. Hello? Oh, they've got their they've got their music in. This one on the left. How this responds, and this is for Swedish response, to see how what the pond would look like. And this is during quite a small rainfall event, probably about 6 or 7 millimeters. So the catchment responds quickly and comes into the infiltration trench, fills the infiltration trench, and then slowly discharges into the thing. All right. So we started off with quite strong inputs from mainly men in the space. But it was incredible to see, as we started working through this project, how these social networks were built and how women started coming in much more than just sort of cooking and doing the support duties. They had a voice. They started pitching up to our community meetings. They were bringing friends and relatives. They were very keen on coming to some of the skills development processes that we put in place. There were things like local indigenous plants, sandbag construction for housing. We painted a mural, so that the women were largely getting involved much more as the project developed. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up with all the things I'm holding. This was the mural painting activity that we did. And in this one particularly, there were children largely involved in doing the visual harvesting. And we started getting much more interest in all of these different multiple functions for this blue-green infrastructure, because now there were different people involved in the various aspects that start contributing to this blue-green city. This just to confirm what Mike told us earlier. These are the 5 commitments that are in their new water strategy. And the 5th one is the transition to a water-sensitive city that starts to look at actively facilitating this transition over time. It particularly focuses on the optimal use of stormwater, so that urban waterways can not only have flood control and aquifer recharge, but that there is a space for these urban waterways to also create recreation opportunities, biodiversity opportunities, that sort of thing. I won't go into this. We did a very comprehensive policy review for the managed aquifer recharge linked to blue-green infrastructure. And what we discovered was that the city has a lot of policy in place that does also take social engagement and gender roles into account. It's largely through broad water policy and through their infrastructure and city planning, but also in the ways in which open and green spaces are managed through community and recreation. And what we saw was that, in general, stormwater ponds are seen as protected infrastructural space. They're public open space. So there's generally no budget associated or cooperation across departments for sort of ongoing blue-green infrastructure, and certainly none to bring people into this space. However, the policies that prioritize the multifunctionality of some of these spaces were extremely important in helping to identify the roles of the different stakeholders that were involved. And as we progress through with this experiment, we're beginning to see those roles coming through very clearly. And here, the social, environmental, and economic benefit to communities is significantly prioritized through all of these policies, as I've said. So needs to be leveraged for planning new blue-green infrastructure for urban water resilience. So just as some of the sort of last reflections, if we want to think about water sensitive or resilient cities, we have to consider obviously hydrology as the first layer within spatial planning, but all of these other aspects, the sort of notion of biodiversity, livability, and amenity become so important here. It's not just about the amount of water we're able to access or gain from these spaces, or the flood alleviation potential from it. But it's also about the use of space. And in that case, it's the ways in which particularly women and children are using these spaces, because they're being used for play functions or for childcare or for education purposes. As you saw, that pond was next to a school. So the spatial and landscape design responses that influence water use have to be thought about in the context of use. And in particular, what we're finding is that, you know, the decisions we make around water from a local governance perspective may often include added burdens for women. So when we develop policy that considers water, we need to develop policy that considers those aspects of dignity, self-assurance, and well-being as well. And this is only really possible if there is concerted effort across different departments, across decision makers, but also across the city and stakeholders as a whole. And I think that's me. There's the point.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Any questions for Kirsty? Johan? Christina?
Okay, thank you, Kirsty, for a nice presentation. So I'm just wondering about the issue of land ownership, because sometimes when you do the design, there might be areas that are more suited in terms of capturing the stormwater, but, you know, how do you resolve that in your design?
So all of this land is all local authority owned land. So this land, it is public open space, but it has as its principal function stormwater management. So the idea behind this project in particular was, how could we use existing stormwater space that should be protected? It often isn't. And another very important reason for thinking about this space in multifunctional ways is that it is then less prone to land invasion, which is a major problem, and it's less prone to social issues like dumping, crime, safety and security issues that happen in this open space throughout the city. But if the city is wanting to involve civil society and start thinking about this distributed blue-green infrastructure as a means to transition to a water-sensitive city, then they have to drive the process of making changes, but then bring civil society in to actually maintain and keep it going. But ownership will remain with the city.
All right, let's go to Andrea.
Thank you so much. It was good to get a lot more background and context on what we saw in the field trip. Can you say a little bit more about the learning alliances? You just had it as a bullet up there. Is it across the different stormwater ponds or more intentionally across different agencies that play a role?
So the learning alliances really relate to the work that we've done in trying to establish frameworks and guidance for water sensitive design as a whole. So, and those learning alliances really have gone across the whole country in terms of the impact of blue-green infrastructure, training around different ways of thinking about it, bringing local people into facilitated conversations about where they see their roles in moving forward with this type of system, bearing in mind that, you know, these neighborhoods are often fairly low income, quite deprived neighborhoods. So there's generally very little ability for them to raise funds to do the work, you know, on a sort of consulted basis. So they have to now form these networks and alliances, coalitions, to try and then be able to raise interest and potential funding through the city's mechanisms, of which there are a number, but they have to be organized in order to be able to access those. So the learning alliances are really sort of broad social learning that we've put in place around this idea of transitioning to water sensitive cities. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Johannes?
Yes, thanks, Kirsty. Very interesting presentation. I have a more fundamental question. You talk about water resilient cities, water resilient strategy. What is your indicator for resilience? We work with policymakers and we try to measure resilience, but we found out, okay, resilience is linked to a kind of external disturbance, to a shock. And then you adapt and you transform. But what is the indicator by which you measure your strategy? Because it's about resources, right? Your
Yeah.
strategy has an success. So when is a city resilient?
When,
Resilient.
yeah, exactly. There has been a lot of discussion about this. Obviously, the term resilient city term came out of the drought because it was linked to the city's ability to make sure that people could access water during a shock that was experienced. And the resilience there was linked to diversifying water sources, to lowering heat, to increasing livability, to creating this water sensitive city. So I think, to be honest, I think that will shift over time depending on how far we get down this road and where things are being achieved in terms of reaching this goal. But it is very much around creating cities that are livable and that provide water at the right level. And I think Mike said a gross provision of 170 liters per person per day. So yeah, it's how to ensure that with all of these different approaches.
Thank you, Marcela.
So thank you, Kirsty, for your talk. And I have a question regarding how a city is conceptualized and what a city is. And you talk about here and what the boundaries of the city are. You talk about creating water sensible cities. And my question is, how good a sensitive township could look like, water sensitive township could look like?
So it's a whole other subject, the whole concept of a water sensitive city. And I can share some of our framework literature with you if you're interested. So of course, what you've picked up is exactly that South Africa is a sort of two worlds in one context. So we have very first world, very developed areas that really mimic most global north cities around the world. And we have other areas where the lack of services really prevents anything from happening in terms of, in actually implementing water sensitive options. So a lot of our research now is looking at what does that mean? What does it mean to make a township or an informal settlement water sensitive? And to be honest, in those cases, it means making jolly sure they've got water and sanitation and drainage provision, because most of them don't have any form of drainage. So we can't talk about putting in rain gardens and, biofiltration cells unless we do it external to the settlement. So we've trialed various things, but they're not going to work in places that are pushed for space, that are not operating well from a service delivery perspective. So there are a whole lot of different ways that we can think about, and it may be through different forms of sanitation, maybe through recycling. It might be through some sort of greening effort, but it has to be done in the context of what other services are being provided. Even things like solid waste removal is a major problem in those environments. So how do we link that into what we're trying to do elsewhere?
Perhaps our last question. We can always come back after lunch for a broader discussion, if you don't mind.
Thanks for touching on the water strategy, the Cape Town water strategy again, because we heard a bit about it this morning, the 2019-2020 water strategy. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of read that you could provide us with on how much political will there was before the drought for projects like this, the stormwater recharge. Was this seen as something that would have been possible before the crisis?
So, to be honest, there's still not an awful lot of political will around stormwater recharge projects. These projects are seen more in terms of the sort of banking, the aquifer banking that can occur at scale, and ensuring that groundwater abstraction can happen in a way that we're making sure that stormwater is managing to infiltrate the city. The city has not included stormwater necessarily as one of their resource options because it is risky and because it's very difficult to manage volumes. They don't know how they're going to get it in, whether it's what the qualities are going to be like. And so the actual stormwater as a resource concept is not being taken up all that well at the moment. No. What we're trying to do is actually show them why it should be. Because not only does it enhance the infiltration of water into the ground and still provide the flood alleviation, but it provides all these extra benefits that really build the sort of indicators or the impact that we're trying to get from a blue-green city. So there is a willingness to engage around it. And we are, I mean, you know, Mike was definitely on our side when he was the executive director at the city. So, but it's not, they haven't written it into their strategy as an alternative resource yet.
Right. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone. We're going to have the opportunity to have Kirsty and Greta after lunch for a session. Thank you. I don't know whether I should make the announcement about lunch, all those things. We're going to have lunch. After lunch, we're coming back here to have a discussion session. After the discussion session, Christina is going to take over. Thank you.